Greetings, Star Trek Symposium in Malta. This is David Kyle Johnson, an Associate Professor of Philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and I'd like to present to you a presentation I've entitled Kirk's Conservative Western Industrial Anti-Communist Agenda. I actually don't remember giving it that name, but it's a good title, so we'll go with that. Of course, we also might call it Why Kirk Might Vote for Trump, and we'll get to that at the end. And this, of course, is some model enterprises that I have in my office. So the presentation I want to give you is based on a chapter I wrote for the Ultimate Star Trek in Philosophy. Chapter's entitled Destroying Utopias, Why Kirk is a Jerk, and it's critical of of Kirk's actions in the apple and this side of paradise. So there are a few ways to understand the point of my presentation I'm about to give you, which is based on that chapter. For one, and this is what I'd like to do in the chapter, I try to do in the chapter, you could see it as defending Ken Ray. Ken Ray's from Rod Roddenberry's podcast, Star Trek Mission Log. He argues that Kirk's actions in the apple and this side of paradise were immoral, so you might see it as a defense of his position on that. You might also see it as an argument that as progressive as Star Trek was, it occasionally served the conservative Cold War cause by vilifying communism and praising industrialism and capitalism. And of course, you could also see it as an argument for why Kirk would likely vote for Trump. We can think of these as we go through. You kind of see all three of them pop up as we go through the presentation. So if we're talking about the apple and this side of paradise, a quick recap of those episodes. You probably likely remember them. The apple is where the Enterprise comes across the blonde, tan people, the feeders of Vol, right? And they have this seemingly perfect society. In which all of their needs are met, they're virtually immortal, and they live under the servitude, supposedly, of this papier-mâché rock machine god named Vol, who basically provides all of their needs, controls their weather, makes them perfectly healthy, but has a few rules that they have to follow, like they can't have sex, and they have to feed him whenever the gong goes off. This side of paradise, of course, is the Spore episode, where Spock is spored by the spores, and he becomes a hippie, basically, and falls in love with a woman. And of course, Kirk undoes all of this. In both episodes, Kirk destroys Vol in the apple, and then of course undoes the effects of the spores in this side of paradise. The argument, basically, that Kirk was wrong in these episodes is that these societies were perfectly fine as they were. Kirk actually made them worse. He should have left well enough alone, and simply let them be. I'm not saying that Kirk's interference is always wrong. I think it was okay for him to undo the patterns of force and the patterns of force, to free the miners of Ecos, right? Is it Ecos? No, sorry. I think I've mixed my episodes there. But most of the time when Kirk acts, usually it's for the better. But in these two particular cases, it was for the worse. He should have left well enough alone, right? So there are a number of responses to the argument that Kirk was wrong in these cases, that these places were basically better off without Kirk's interference. You might argue that, well, Kirk had to do what he did to save his ship, had to do what he did to save his ship. But of course, Kirk makes it clear that he would have destroyed these utopias even if his ship wasn't in danger. And that's the attitude that I'm arguing is wrong. Not necessarily that it was wrong for him to save the ship, but that his attitude that regardless of the ship, these utopias should be undone. There's the mistake. That's the wrong. Some people object that the spores were drugs, and of course, drugs are bad, okay? And so we have to, get rid of the spores because they're like drugs. But the spores are not like a conventional, harmful, addictive drug. They're more like a one-time dose antidepressant that bestows perfect health. There's nothing wrong, it doesn't seem, with that kind of drug or taking that kind of drug, especially if one voluntarily takes that kind of drug, which we'll address that objection here in a minute. Some people argue that the feeders of Vol were slaves, and so morally they would need to be freed from that slavery. But this doesn't seem likely to me. It seems that Vol likely saved that planet from an ecological disaster, that society invented and then chose a life under Vol instead of the life that they had before, that they likely had destroyed their planet, much like we're destroying ours, right? And that Vol solved their problem. They voluntarily chose to live under that. It's not clear at all that they were slaves. you could look at them as simply fueling a machine that provides for their needs, right? So the feed me gong that goes off whenever Vol needs food, is that him commanding to be fed, or is that simply his fuel gauge? My fuel gauge is low sound, and that tells the feeders of Vol that they need to basically give him fuel so that he can keep doing what he's doing, right? Which is what they want him to do. I am not a slave to my car whenever its gas gauge goes off any more than the feeders of Vol are a slave to Vol whenever his fuel gauge goes off, right? Kirk would argue that these places needed to be undone because they were not progressing, they were not accomplishing anything, that their society was stagnant. But they had already accomplished the elimination of war, poverty, and need. Right? What more do you want? I mean, basically, they've already progressed to a point where there's no need for any more progression. Is progressing somehow intrinsically good, so that if you get to your goal, you need to undo it so you can progress to that goal again because you always need to be progressing? Shouldn't it be that once you reach the goal, then that's good, that you should stay there, right? In fact, some would argue that it doesn't allow for eudaimonia and self-actualization, life in these kinds of utopias, but eudaimonia and self-actualization are both still possible in both of these utopias. Perhaps even more possible before pre-Kirk, right? Before Kirk comes along, it's much more possible to accomplish eudaimonia and self-actualization before Kirk comes along, because you can only accomplish these things if you have all of your needs met, and they have all of their needs met. Kirk makes it to where they won't have all of their needs met. Now, Kirk might argue that they have no freedom in these societies, but that's not quite clear at all. The feeders of Vol had laws, but they likely have more freedom than us or Kirk. They had very, very few laws. We live under many more laws than the feeders of Vol did. And it's not clear that freedom's worth much because the feeders of Vol are going to be dead within a week because of Kirk. He basically Vol provided for them for tens of thousands of years. They have no idea how to take care of themselves, except for the giant orgy they're going to have that, after Kirk leaves, the night after Kirk leaves, they're going to struggle to survive and all starve to death within at least a week or a month. It is not a freedom that's worth it, right? Now, the people infected by the spores didn't freely choose to be infected by the spores, but Kirk doesn't even consider the option of one freely choosing to live under the influence of the spores. Wouldn't the spores who give one perfect health make a perfect retirement colony? What about people who are terminally ill? Could they not choose to live under the spores? This is not even something that crosses Kirk's mind in regard to freedom. And in fact, they're not free at all. They're only free to live the kind of life that Kirk sees fit. Even Robert Nozick would think that they should be left alone. And Robert Nozick's like the quintessential libertarian, right? See Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He basically argued that if people wanted to band together and live in a communistic society, they should. They shouldn't be able to force that on anyone else, but they should be able to live that way if they see fit. The same would apply for the utopias, for the feeders of Vol and for the people infected by the spores. If people want to choose to live that kind of life, they should be able to choose to do that, but Kirk does not see that as an option. Kirk takes that freedom away from them. Kirk also argues that they have it too easy. They need to struggle to survive. We'll look at a couple of quotes that show that in these two episodes. But that's not quite clear. For one thing, that's really easy to say when you're a starship captain and you have all of your needs met, electronically, right? Like by living in the 22nd century, 23rd century, that you have all of your needs met, right? He doesn't really struggle to survive, right? Kirk, it's kind of hypocritical because Kirk does not struggle to survive. Notice how people in a poverty-stricken nation would view these kinds of episodes, especially the Feeders of Vol episode, right? The apple. Kirk would be seen as a villain. These people have solved all of their problems. They have no bad weather. They have no disasters. They live forever. They have perfect health. They have all the food that they need. They've solved all of the world's problems. And then Kirk comes along and undoes it all. Like Kirk would be seen as a giant villain. Think of it this way. Couldn't aliens look at us and think the same thing as Kirk did, that we have it way too easy? Most of us do not grow our own food, even wash our own clothes. A machine does that for us. We could not even, as the illustration here shows, we couldn't even make toast on our own if it were not for modern conveniences, right? What if aliens Kirked us? What if aliens came along and said, you know what, you guys have it too easy. You need to struggle to survive. There's value in the struggle itself, so we're taking away all your modern technology. Would we think that they were this wonderful savior of humanity? Would they be No. They wouldn't. So why do we praise Kirk in these episodes? Why do we think Kirk is doing a good thing when that's essentially what he's doing to them? Right? So that's the argument that Kirk was wrong. When it comes to the Cold War and conservatism, I think these episodes are what they are because although Star Trek was definitely progressive for its time, it played a part in the conservative efforts of the culture wars and the Cold War. The victims of the spores in this side of paradise were stereotypes of hippies who basically hang around in communes and contribute nothing to society. Their main vice was, in the words of their post-spore leader Sandoval, no accomplishments. Right, just like hippies, they don't accomplish anything. They do not contribute to society, supposedly. Right. Towards the beginning of the episode, we get this quote from Kirk: "We weren't meant for that. None of us. Man stagnates if he has no ambition, no desire to be more than he is." Sandoval says, "But we have everything we need, except the challenge," Kirk says, right? So this is this kind of anti-hippie attitude, I think, that's being displayed in the episode. In the Apple, the feeders of Vol are communists who have all of their wants and needs provided by the state. They don't have to struggle to survive, which is seen as a bad thing. They are akin to slaves. As McCoy puts it, there are certain absolutes, and one of them is the right of humanoids to a free and unchained environment, the right to have conditions that permit growth. These humanoids are intelligent. They need to advance and grow. There's been no progress here in at least 10,000 years. This isn't life, it's stagnation. Right, and this is how a lot of people viewed communism. I mean, Marx argued that communism would be kind of the epitome of human development. It'd be the last piece of social progress that would happen. And there would be, I mean, no more progress in a certain kind of way, and everyone would be equal, everyone would have their needs met, and that kind of stuff, right? And so not only are we not struggling to survive, but we don't have to, we have all of our needs met in that way, and so we don't get to progress, and that's seen as a bad thing, right? Here's a quote from my article in The Ultimate Star Trek and Philosophy. "The criticisms of Vol seem to echo the criticisms of communism and the control a communist government must exercise in providing for its people. When the freedom of democracy and capitalism leaves people hungry in the street, while communism promises to provide food and shelter for all, defenders of democracy and capitalism have to make suffering and the struggle to survive a good thing. Even when communism isn't delivering on its promises, what communism promises must be painted as an evil. It's the same imperialist attitude the American colonists took toward the Native Americans. They're savages who need Bibles and trousers. It never crossed the mind of European settlers that the natives should be left alone to live their life as they saw fit." Right? Ironically, there's only one place where Kirk seems to take the opposite view, and it's when he's not Kirk, but Kirok in the Paradise Syndrome. Whenever Elder Goro asks, "Have we displeased you? Perhaps we have not improved as quickly as the wise ones wish." And Kirok responds, "Your land is rich, your people happy. Who could be displeased with that?" You could, Kirk. You are the one who's been displeased with societies exactly like the Native Americans in the Paradise Syndrome, right? One wonders if Kirk ever looked back with regret. That episode actually happens after both the episode of the Apple and the Paradise Syndrome. Right? There are other episodes, I think, where you see these kinds of messages, like in Return of the Archons. I think you see an anti-communist kind of message. In This Way to Eden, you obviously see an anti-hippie message. I, Mud makes a big deal about the "you must struggle to survive" motif or message. Specifically in a little play that McCoy and Scotty do, they specifically say they can't be happy unless they're lamenting their burdens. They're struggling to survive, right? So, in short, Kirk is a Western industrial anti-communist capitalist bent on imposing his way of life on others. Today, these episodes could just as easily be seen as critiques of European-style socialism, for it is the socialist aspects of communism that were being criticized most in these episodes. This is what makes them, quote-unquote, non-progressive in the modern sense of the word. This is very ironic, of course, given the kind of socialist society that's portrayed in The Next Generation, right? Right. So, and of course, I'm not the first one to notice this kind of thing, right? So, why would Kirk vote for Trump? Basically, very quickly, to put it very quickly, because Kirk's an authoritarian, and authoritarians like Trump. An authoritarian is someone who values subjugation to an authority over individual freedom. They usually do so in the name of order and have a particular view about how things should be ordered in the way people should live their lives. They're obedient to strong leaders and demand conformity to traditional norms. This is Kirk. Kirk is an authoritarian. He believes that his ideas about how life should be lived are superior to others and that they should be forced onto others. Although he says he values freedom, it's only the freedom to live life as he thinks it should be lived. He cannot tolerate others living according to other norms. By some accounts, the one thing Trump voters have in common that others don't is authoritarianism. They crave a leader to make everyone live as they see fit, especially in a moral sense. If this is right and Kirk was forced to vote and he couldn't just run himself, it seems that Kirk would vote for Trump. That's the argument. There's a fairly major objection to this argument, though, and that is that further data seems to indicate that it was Cruz supporters who were authoritarian. Trump supporters were more populists. They're easily confused, and they have some characteristics in common, but what sets populists apart from authoritarians is they believe elites have absconded the virtuous people. Populists distrust authority and expertise and have a strong nationalist identity. All right, but there's a couple of replies that one might give to still argue that Kirk might vote for Trump. First, given Kirk's relationship to Starfleet, it's not clear that Kirk isn't a populist too, so he still may like Trump for that reason. But secondly, now that Cruz is out of the picture, Trump supporters are more populist and more authoritarian. So still, Kirk would still likely vote for Trump, and there's a source of the article that depicts that. And I'm not the only one to have noticed this. Clearly, this seems to be a distinction between Kirk and Picard as captains, and I think the way that the Federation and Starfleet and the world is portrayed in both Classic Trek and Next Generation Classic Trek is much more conservative, and Next Generation is much more socialist, as it were. All right, so that's it. Hopefully, find it enlightening. Let's have some questions.